Welcome to Glad You Asked today. Today we got an exciting question, maybe one that you've asked before of yourself and of the scripture. Where did Cain get his wife, or who did Cain marry? So we want to take some time to deal with that. Obviously, there are several different answers and that people have come up with throughout theology and history. And so we want to talk about that. So when we look at the scripture, we know from Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, Cain knew his wife and she conceived and bore Enoch. And so we know that in the scriptures, Cain had a wife, so where did she come from? Now, I want to give you three options that are available. I'll tell you one that I prefer. And so when we take a look at scripture, option number one is that Cain would have married his sister or maybe even a close relative. And so let's take a look at that. So according to Jewish Midrash, which was earlier writings of Jewish sages, so to speak, there was even they even teach that Cain was born as a twin, that he had a twin sister, and that he married her, or also that Abel had two sisters, and maybe that Cain married one of Abel's sisters. So we know that Adam and Eve had multiple children. According to Josephus, he says that Adam and Eve probably had like 56 children. Imagine that. You got to remember they lived a lot longer than we live. So I think it's 33 sons and 23 daughters. And so there's a lot of family members there, obviously, that they could have married. And so when you take a look at the scripture, you know that, okay, so Adam and Eve did have sons and daughters. We know that from Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. It says, when Adam lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image. He named him Seth. And the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. So verse 3 and 4, we know that Adam and Eve had other children. So a sister or another close relative would obviously be somebody that Cain could have taken as his wife. Now that leads to the problem of incest, and some of us would go, well, obviously they were practicing incest, and so that would be true. But most of the occurrences of incest in Scripture occur in Genesis. Like you don't see them being elaborated on until later in the Scripture. So, for example, you have in Genesis, you have these such moments where there could be these occasions for incest in order to be fruitful and multiply. And you don't really get any laws concerning incest until you get to Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which would have been over 400 years from the Genesis text. And so the incest laws are laid down in the writings of the Torah as Moses gives the law to the people. We know that intermarrying was the norm and still was encouraged by God among the people, in particular to stay within your clan or stay within Israel, to look for a wife or a husband within the people who would held your customs and know your culture, have the same religious beliefs and same values. And so it was important for them to keep everybody in the clan, so to speak. In other words, God is God. And so we see this throughout the Old Testament, that we run into these incest laws, but these occur at a much later date than Cain and even Seth would have lived. And so let me give you a couple of those incest laws, and you can take a closer look at them. The first real big section we find is in Leviticus 18, verses 6 through 11. And so it says, none of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness, which is a reference to sex. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. And you shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, or for the nakedness of their own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter brought up in your father's family since she is your sister. So we see these laws laid out in Leviticus. We also have a reiteration of that in Deuteronomy chapter 27, which you can go read verses 20 through 23. So this is one option, is that Cain and Seth would have married their sisters or a close relative. Option number 2 would be that Cain was actually had sex with his mom, Eve, which I think for most of us would be even like just morally even worse to be with Eve. And so the problem with that thought that I'll throw out real quickly is the first thing that pops up is if Cain knew his wife, then he had a wife, and Eve was Adam's wife, so she would not be referred to as Cain's wife. So that seems to eliminate the fact that Eve would have been the one who would have given birth to Cain's children. And so we see that option 2 is not really a viable option. And then option 3 would be that people would say, well, obviously there were other people in the world at the time. In other words, there's the Adam and Eve clan, and that there would have been other clans because, after Cain killed his brother Abel, he got sent off by God, and then it said Cain knew his wife. But it doesn't say that Cain didn't have a wife before he killed Abel. And so when we look at that, and we say, could Cain have run into other families? So with Cain, there are some real anthropological problems with that, and which would be theological problems for us if that was the case, because we've all descended from Adam, and therefore we have the imputation of Adam's sin, according to Romans chapter 5, that everybody was under the penalty of death because of their sin, which is not only the personal sin that they commit, but also imputed from Adam. So that option seems to be a real problem. And then, just in terms of there's no indication from Scripture that there were any other people outside of Adam anyhow, so it would be just further speculation. And so if we go with the text, the way that it's written, so the literal sense makes sense, use no other sense, we see that the best option is option number 1, that Cain most likely married his sister or another close relative like a niece or something of that sort. They lived an incredibly long time, so there have been plenty of time for reproduction, multiplying and filling the earth, and so we see this. And some may argue, well, Pastor, if you're saying that there was incest and it seems like God's approved, God never says he approves of incest anywhere in the Scripture. It's just later down the road, the law is given so that incest is something that people should avoid. And I would argue that this doesn't undermine the Scripture at all, that this actually gives reliability to the Scripture, because the writers of the Scripture are not trying to whitewash what is written in Scripture so that we feel comfortable, like everything's pure and everything. I think it's just an accurate account, historical narrative of what went down when God created the world. Humanity fell into sin, and then the things that happened in order to get to where we are today. And so one of the things that I would remind you is we take a look at this text of Scripture, just like we take a look at every text of Scripture, there are a lot of things we don't exactly know. And God is giving us what we know, revelation, so that we can know Him, but also what He doesn't share with us is obviously something that in the mind of God, He believes that we don't need to know, and it's not necessary for our living and day-to-day faith, and so therefore we're not revealed these things because maybe they're just not that important. Who was Cain's wife and what was her name? Obviously, God didn't think we needed to know, so He didn't reveal. But as we take a look at Scripture, I think that we can take a look and say, well, these are the 3 options. Cain was probably married to his sister or a close relative. It could have been Eve, and it could have been maybe somebody else. But option 2 and 3 don't seem to me to be the best option. So option 1 seems the best option because the literal sense makes the most sense. And so I would go with option number 1, that Cain was married to either his sister because he had a lot of them, or a niece or something in that reference point. So thank you for joining us for Glad You Asked today. Hopefully this is encouraging for you and insightful. If you have a question that you'd like for me to entertain, I would love to take that on. So if you want to email us at info@gracepointchurch.org. Don't forget the E after the T. We would love to hear from you. May God bless you as you go about your week.